Okay, great. We're recording. So, I guess the way I was thinking about this is I could. How would you like to do this interview? Do you prefer more conversational, or do you prefer sort of more of a question and answer?
Um, what's the difference?
One of them is that I give my opinion more.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay. So let's start with forensics then, since you're studying forensic you're still in your forensic architecture program, right?
It's forensic architecture isn't a program. It's the program's called Center for Research Architecture. Forensic
Mm-hmm.
architecture was a research um, grant. It was a research. What do you call it now? It was a research team. It was a research project. It was yeah, like a funded research platform kind of thing, which involved many different practitioners. And yeah, I had some. Yeah, I was working with them sometimes. Yeah.
And are you still? I suppose is your practice still this? Your practice has involved forensic questions, especially around voice, for a substantial amount of time. Is it still on those tracks?
In a way, yeah. Well, I mean, those questions are still very sort of raw for me in the sense that also I'm starting to myself to sort of practice some of the sort of types of analysis that I have been researching in some respects. And in many ways, forensic listening, for me, as much as it deviates from my own kind of politics, i.e., as much as it's kind of a part of the culture of surveillance and analysis of voice, and as much as it's a wing of the police and state
Mm-hmm.
kind of police activities, it's still extremely inspiring for me. It's the most inspiring sort of practice of uh, sonic practice, the most inspiring strand of also sonic thinking, and so I've found much more kind of inspiration in the types of practices of listening that some of the subjects of the interviews I've done over the years with various people who are kind of expert listeners who have worked on multiple cases where in which the kind of phonetic makeup of an accent or other types of the identity of other types of sound have played in a kind of um, legal battle over somebody's culpability or
Mm-hmm.
identity or the rest of it. So, and why it's inspiring and why it's more than just a kind of research subject for me, why it's much more than a subject of research, more a kind of approach, is that I am, it's the really, expands the kind of acoustic consciousness, if you like, expands the lexicon of sounds, and really nothing falls outside of signification with forensic listening. Everything
Yep.
every
Absolutely.
sound can kind of testify in some way or another. And I find that kind of fascinating approach to the world. I also think
Right.
that the way those practitioners listen, i.e., one of the guys who told me he spent 3 working days listening to one word from a police interview tape, that type of radical approach to sound is also, really at the kind of forefront of insisting on sound as a material,
Right.
sound as um, uh, uh, dissectable object,
Absolutely.
and I think also in some respects that really differs from a lot of the way that sound has been talked about in academic literature, in what we would call maybe audio culture, right, where in which people talk about sounds, ephemerality, its intangibility, and this kind of gives it this sort of transhistoricity and leaves it without its kind of politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Okay.
think this kind of forensic antithesis is very inspiring for me in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Can you? So I'm curious about some other kinds of listening that you would oppose this to. So, for example, I seem like you mentioned certain academic characterization of sound, which maybe might just be not listening. But I'm curious. about other kinds of listening that you compare this to. For example, I mean the thing that might come to mind is the kind of listening that you do in a conversation, right? As where you can replay things, or maybe passive listening, where you aren't interpreting things, but they do become kind of ambient. And then what the political valences of those kinds of listening might be, whether those are something that you think is whether that's something that you think is done too much of, or those also have for you similarly inspiring properties or their own places.
Uh,
Does that make sense as a question?
no, I didn't understand.
Okay, sorry.
You mean, do I take inspiration from other types of listening other than forensic listening?
Or I was wondering if you could run us, since you spend so much time thinking about listening, if you could run us through a list of other kinds of listening that are interesting to you.
Um, a list. Uh, yeah, I mean, one thing that I've also been interested in the way that things have shaped the way we listen today is auscultation, which is the listening that doctors do to patients with
Mm-hmm.
a stethoscope.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't say it's totally distinct from a kind of forensic listening or a type of diagnostic listening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what's interesting is that, of course, when the stethoscope was invented in 1816 by René Laennec, it really makes this kind of turning point where in which the doctors no longer listen to what the patients are saying, i.e., their own kind of
Right.
subjective accounts of their ailments, but actually rather listen to um, the sounds of their bodies, right? And this
Mm-hmm.
idea that sounds from stomachs and hearts and lungs are sounds that don't lie, whereas which patients tend to overemphasize, right, their problems. And this really starts to get at the core of why I'm interested in a lot of these types of listening, because they pose really interesting questions for how there starts to become a kind of subject-object divide within of sometimes the same voice. One voice is uttered, but it's heard in various distinct ways, and means that there's a kind of division of the voice between kind of, let's say, the subject speaking or the language that it issues and its kind of sonic or object quality. And I think that kind of whichever type of listening it is, wherever that is at stake, that kind of small, minute fluctuation between, let's say, the voice as a kind of conduit for language and that conduit itself. I feel that tension is really where a whole series of kind of politics pour out and are opened up, because they really get to the heart of this idea that Hannah Arendt and many other people have talked about as inherently political, because speech is, after all, kind of what makes us political animals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so these kind of these deviations in listening are kind of something that I'm always attuned to in ways in which they affect the role of the subject, the role of veridiction, i.e., truth-telling, and the role of political agency, fundamentally.
Great. That was part of that. That was part of my interest was how conversational forms of listening relate to more forensic forms of listening. Because, like you said, there's a difference between listening to a statement as a form of evidence and being attuned to, for example, its I suppose like the accent and the way in which it's said, as opposed to listening to it for a certain kind of I suppose in a less diagnostic way, um, and trying to understand maybe the content of what someone's saying, as apart from I suppose that to listen to the person's self-diagnosis as opposed to their heartbeat, in the terms of the stethoscope. Another question I had for you was about the the range of your work. So you are, like you said, I don't know. Maybe you could expand about this a little bit more. you're now working in some of those forensic capacities, and you've made a sort of more radio documentary style work as well, and then you've also sort of made work for the context of the armory, and then you also write um, in a more academic context. So you really are working with very focusedly on these questions of listening and knowledge and truth and the political uses of listening, but across all these different terrains. And so I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to navigate all those different terrains and to receive different kinds of support and have different kinds of expectations, and how you think of your role in being in these multiple spaces.
Yeah, I mean, uh, they each facilitate something in the other, if you see what I mean. They're all
Yeah.
kind of like codependent. Each audience that is subject to a work of mine is important in that it kind of provides the whole that I'm kind of trying to um, aspire to with the sort of output of some of the work. So I feel like there's a lot. I mean, I'm coming for as an artist initially, but I feel like oftentimes artists never ask themselves the question of, does this work make sense as a kind of artwork classically now, as we might classically think of it? Does it make sense that um, this idea finds its natural home in the gallery, or is that just simply where I am forced to place myself because that's the kind of system in which I operate in?
Hmm.
So I think for me, it's always about what each context demands, and how one work or one idea can exist in kind of multiple spaces or in multiple outputs. Um, Having said that, the kind of work I've done, where in which, say, the work I did to analyze if whether or not the Israelis were firing live ammunition or rubber bullets at Palestinian teenagers, resulting in the death of two
Hmm.
teenage boys, or when I've been called as a witness to talk about accent tests in the UK, each one of those moments um, had also its kind of fallout in a way, in the sense that really oftentimes in the art context, what is kind of fetishized by curators and other types of practitioners is the idea of going to the outside, leaving the white cube and going into the real world,
Right.
and kind of initiating some kind of change, right? And that's
Graduating
this
from
idea
the
that
art world.
artists,
Yeah.
yeah, like can better the world, right? Well, actually, I don't think that that's completely wrong, but what I would like to insist on is that those moments where one ends up in a courtroom and has to testify about something shouldn't be heralded as kind of heroic moments of the kind of artist initiating change. Rather, they should be thought of as the moment of the deepest compromise of the kind of artist's politics, of their uh, position in the world. And oftentimes, those cases which I've worked on have really only ever served to benefit. I mean, and this is a bit harsh on myself, but it really only has served to benefit the people who were directly implicated within it, right? Often the broader politics that they were dealing with is left completely compromised. For example, in a courtroom, if you have to speak with a very thin bandwidth of kind of audible terms and political positionality, because anything that they could deem as radical will mean that your testimony is invalid, right? So
Yeah.
for them, radical is to say that they shouldn't have accent tests of asylum seekers in order to determine their origin. Uh, but if I to express what I really think is that the border itself shouldn't exist, then the whole testimony would be laughed out of court and they would just chuck me out, right? So these are spaces of so-called kind of free speech, right? But you can say whatever you want, but
Right.
if they're not wanting to hear it, or if they're not willing to hear it, or if they consider it as a radical voice, then the whole thing is just thrown out, and you help neither the asylum seeker who's in the box nor your nor anyone else by saying it, right? But
Right.
it's what you really think.
Well, that's the
So
sort of implicit politics of tolerance and the limits of tolerance, right? That you can tolerate people without giving them any credibility or credulity.
exactly, exactly. And that's really performed very well. And with someone like me who's very much interested in the limits of audibility and what can be said and what can't be said and all what becomes speakable, essentially, these questions are very kind of they're always at the forefront of my mind. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that in a way, participating, let's say, outside of the gallery space into the real world, quote unquote, reinforced my desire or reinforced the power, actually, of the gallery space as a place in which one can really produce the conditions of listening that you require for any given kind of context, right? Where in which the other spaces are kind of understood as compromised listening spaces of audibility or spaces in which you enter the conditions of listening which are sometimes totally counter to the politics that you're trying to present, or a condition of listening where you yourself are just totally kind of negatable or tolerated, as you would put it.
Absolutely.
It really comes back to this idea of what is the gallery space as this kind of last space where liable speech doesn't apply, the kind of space of artifice, of artificiality, of duplicity, this place where all these things can still find themselves quite naturally to exist. So if you kind of see my point, it's like I'm never going to stop trying to
Right.
participate in such legal things, but I really think that they should be considered as not as these kind of heroic gestures, but actually to be considered very modestly as the moments where in which one is doing something for the benefit of an individual or something else, rather than a kind of greater moral good, right, of the artist and of the art
Right.
world and of all the rest of it. Yeah.
The way that
So,
rhetoric usually gets expressed is in terms of almost like an escape from the art world. I, I'm sorry. Were you gonna? I'm sorry. I think I cut you off.
no. You go on.
I had a question for you now about so you just talked a little bit about whether those how those conceptions of the real play out, how art world. So I asked you a question about how you navigate your different worlds, and you talked about the relationship between being the gallery context and the courtroom, and how there's certain things possible in each that aren't possible in the other. And it seems like you've talked about how there's particular sort of local changes that you can affect in the courtroom to benefit particular individuals, whereas what you're interested in the gallery context is maybe something more like uh, an overall redefinition of values or something, or intervening at a sort of a more general level.
Yeah, intervening into more or less, or redesigning, or attempting to at least how we are being heard and how we listen in a way, or pushing that a little bit onto one's
Right.
interlocutors or one's audience, right? A little bit.
And
That's yeah.
And one, it's certainly possible to do that in the gallery context, or certainly possible to make those claims in a way that's not to make those non-liable claims, as you put it. But the kind of the inverse of that would be to say that in the gallery context, it's not possible to make binding claims, um, which is just to say that anything is permissible because um, things don't have because people don't actually listen, or that because there is no real connection, as far as I can tell, between the intentions of or the political intents of artists and then the effects of their artwork in the world. Um, and that's a little bit of a polemic way to put it, but let's bring it to a specific work, like for example, 5,000 Tiny Bags, or the 5,000 Tiny Bags in it's a convention of tiny movements, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the 5,000 plastic chips together with the sort of the hidden audio surveillance setup that you included in the armory. Um, is my one way to interpret that work is as a um, and this is a very simple sort of reading, but I suppose maybe you'd say listening, um, is as a um, an so an insertion of um, sort of making more visible or making more audible a surveillance culture within the context of the fair space. And but the thing about those bags is they act as don't they act as a gesture towards um, surveillance culture rather than actual instantiation of surveillance culture? I suppose what I mean is
Yeah.
does that make sense? I'm a little bit fuzzy on my words today, but my question turns a little bit on the frequency by which sort of actual existing practices gestured towards in art, and these gestures are often um, sort of half committed or less than complete, which makes binding political claims as opposed to liable claims, difficult to enforce in the art world context.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, that's why I said before, it's not about one or the other. It's about trying to do them all at once. But what I meant before was that there is certain merits to the art space which are often not thought through in the context of people who think that there is always the idea of the greater good beyond that space,
Oh,
right?
sure, yeah.
And beyond representation or all these kinds of things. Yeah, and it's true that it's not always possible to collapse those things. Sometimes they do collapse. Sometimes one's aesthetic practice is exactly in line with one's kind of politics. Or, for example, in the bullets case, I had to visualize a series of I had to produce spectrograms of gunshots, and only then I could hear how that sounded. So the kind of forms that the visual language necessitated as part of the investigation were also part and parcel of the aesthetic practice. If you kind of see what you see what I mean, so it's collapsed there, right?
Yeah.
Where in which the image you produce is both a piece of investigation and an image at the same moment, right?
Right.
A form of representation and a form of evidence collapsed into one, if you like, in some respects. And yeah, it's not always possible to do that, but that doesn't mean that that's always also the ultimate goal. In the Armory show, it was more about trying to think of a way in which we could conceive of this new reality, in which objects will be recording our every word. And that's based on a series of experiments that are happening in MIT right now, where in which they've realized they can kind of extract speech from objects using high-speed video camera. Mm-hmm. So it poses a kind of interesting way of thinking about the next world, in which we'll be really considering what we're going to be wearing in terms of how our speech is going to be heard, etc. Right? What we're going to be wearing, what kind of things surround us, what we thought were insignificant objects, yeah, or ubiquitous items or trash or whatever else we thought actually can be turned into kind of listening devices. So in a way, what I was trying to do, or if you like, if I should or would try to reinsert some value into your kind of reading of my project there, it's actually that there's some attempt to kind of get ahead of that curve, to actually, rather than make a kind of critical analysis of something that already exists right now, actually to try and think about the near future and exactly how we're going to be operating in this world as a gesture towards kind of trying to use the research to not only just be critical of and then, of course, at the same moment subject to the same types of surveillance politics that we all are today, i.e., after a whistleblower comes out, then we all kind of jump and kind of get on top of surveillance culture. Rather, actually, it's about kind of sort of relinquishing at the stage before the state has even kind of invested fully in such a technology, to actually start to conceive of it at that stage. Do you kind of see what I mean?
Yes, I see what you mean. It's not. I wonder what.
And at the same time, of course, it was to produce not only a comment on surveillance culture, but also on, of course, the kinds of environment that I was displaying the work in, which is, of course, an art fair.
Right.
And kind of unlike auctions and all these other types of things where a price is made kind of audible, right?
Yeah.
The art fair has its own kind of way of doing things, more hushed conventions of
Absolutely.
speech, if you like, which, of course, for many people have, of course, accused the art market of something that would be entirely illegal in any other form of business, right?
Sure.
Insider trading, all other kinds of things that go on there, which are completely out and out illegal in other types of worlds.
Right.
And so placing something like a ubiquitous chips bag that some people may or may not understand as listening to them starts to kind of problematize those conventions of speech in that space also.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was also about using the traffic of the Armory Fair as a kind of producer of a kind of rumor around these most ubiquitous and kind of bizarre object of the potato chip packet, to kind of start to think about also the sort of way in which both the kind of digestive system and the system of discourse at a fair like that can actually be also a kind of productive of an artwork in itself.
That's very helpful for me. I suppose that it's almost like what you're saying is that the what you had chosen to create was not so much a gesture towards near future context, rather like an actual model of it.
It was to try and think about ways in which we could conceive of this world before it kind of lands on us, and then we have to kind of try and battle it. Maybe it's interesting to start to think about what the future of objects are before the state decides what they are for us.
Two more questions for you. One of them is just in terms of for our viewership, which is mostly sort of North American and Chinese based, what are ways in which you think that people this is not really related to art, but what are ways that you think that people can mobilize effectively against surveillance culture, including sort of the politics of liable listening?
I think in a way, for me, it's just been about not imagining it as something that is simply subjected upon us from the top down, but actually that a lot of these tools are not things which are alien to us. You know, we can actually use the tools back onto the state on whatever else we do. There's a kind of idea that you can kind of co-opt such devices, and that's what I've been doing. A lot of the work I do, the analysis work, is nothing to do with being an expert or as you know, or as a kind of forensic listener. It's actually just things that most musicians, DJs, whoever else who's been kind of messing around with music software for the last 10 years knows exactly how to do, right? So in a way, what I'm trying to say is it's not this kind of expert position, and it's not this kind of high-tech thing that's coming down upon us. The NSA is using the same speech recognition softwares that we have on our iPhone, right?
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. And so I think it's exactly, on the one hand, about not accepting the monopoly over such technologies by the state. And on the other hand, also, I think materiality has a lot to play here. I think, you know, this is something that Trevor Peglin always says with his work. It's that, in a way, these things that have the language of ephemerality, of intangibility, such as the Ethernet or the cloud, right? Each one of them takes on a kind of an air of intangibility, i.e. it's something kind of magical, right, to us.
Yeah.
But in fact has a very concrete material reality, and in the world, the corporate world, of course, it's called data mining, which it's a process of extracting from the earth, which is very kind of material, of course. And of course, the government calls it cables. And that is because in a sense they are cables. So it's also about breaking down this kind of, and I guess the both answers are doing the same thing. So it's about kind of turning back these tools and about understanding that none of these things are out of reach. They're not intangible, but actually very much within of our kind of the same tools that we would perhaps consider part of a creative practice, be it music in my context or sound production. Or other types of visual equivalents in kind of video analysis, etc., etc. Things that perhaps video artists are very used to, you know. So there's these kinds of things, and I think yeah, that's the kind of answer to your question. But I wanted to say one last thing, actually, in reference to your other question about this kind of wholeness. Or the multiple outputs of a practice, of a project. And just to say that, you know, for me it was also important that when I was developing the truths, when I was positing truths about what kind of sound was what, I was at the same time developing another work that was about the right to lie and the right to secrecy. And so, in a way, they're never. Sometimes one poses a truth whilst at the same time talking about the kind of inherent impossibility of truth itself, right? So I think this is what's kind of very interesting in this role of having this kind of non-liable speech next to practices that would be perhaps where in which you would need to facilitate some kind of liability, or you need to practice some kind of or posit some kind of truth. That there is always the role of kind of artifice within of any kind of production of evidence. And I think also the more artists kind of reclaim that again, i.e. they don't leave the aesthetic production of evidence to the hands of people like Colin Powell when he presents his case for war in Iraq in 2003, i.e.
Right.
a whole series of color images, sound recordings, subtitles, all kinds of audiovisual languages that he used to make that case. Of course, it's also about reclaiming that production of evidence as well as an aesthetic practice from those people who are in kind of powerful positions, right?
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I guess one final question, and actually this has to do, I imagine would have a little bit to do with your musical practice, is we've talked a lot about sort of the semantic qualities of listening in order to achieve some kind of knowledge that then can be leveraged in a certain way. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the more affective sides of listening. And I imagine, and maybe a related question is whether or not you think that those things are easily separable.
Yeah. So let me just think about that. Affective.
So let's say, for
types of
example, listening as I guess as soon as I said that, I was thinking about affective too, because one way in which listening to music takes place is a sort of bodily listening that's not necessarily that's not necessarily verbalized, but that's not necessarily affective. Although the rhetoric around it is often affective. So maybe the kinds of listening that your music is intended to evoke that aren't necessarily leading towards some form of interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, even with music, I feel like it's very precise what I want to say with it and what I want to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's always a precision, but it doesn't necessarily mean that another reading of it can't exist. It just means that for my purposes, my approach to it, my practice has always been about trying to get closer to some kind of question, whether that be in writing lyrics or writing a script for a film or making a track or, in fact, the kind of things that I would choose to play in a DJ set, for example. All those things are kind of very precise, conceptually at least. I at least try to make them precise, um, whether or not it's received as such, right? So I think, as I said before, forensic listening for me is something more than a theoretical curiosity. It's actually a kind of aesthetic practice, a theoretical practice that I approach a whole range of things within the same vein, if you like. So, of course, affect comes into that in a huge way. But that can also be a kind of precise thing. It's not like there's this unspeakable sort of. It's not like there's like the effect of a work and its meaning, and those are two separate things, right?
Right. So there's no.
Yeah.
So I suppose you wouldn't say there's a kind of an erratic quality.
What?
Just like that there isn't an aura, something that's totally impossible to. I mean, this is sort of a trope about art production, is that it produces something that's that constantly eludes interpretation. That there's like a remainder that's irreducible to the process of cognition.
Yeah, I think it exactly can do that, but I think that I don't aspire in my own. I don't rest on that as an idea, you know.
Yeah.
It's not about this idea that I make something and you can just think what you want and I can think what I want when I was making it, and it's not this kind of what you would call perhaps a what's this word that they use a lot?
That would be more relativist.
Artists use a lot. In what's this word they use all the time?
I feel like an anthropologist. What's this word they use? I'm not sure. There are multiple words. You mean what's used to excuse the multiple interpretations?
No, there's a specific word I'm looking for. It's like anyway, I'll think about it.
Okay, so that's a
intuitive.
Oh, okay.
It's like this pure intuition, right?
Right.
The artist as a kind of intuitive interpreter of the world. I find that a little bit difficult.
I mean, philosophically, intuition is always a problematic category because I think it's defined as a form of knowledge that's gained outside of experience. So it's always it's a big question for actually in a debate that's probably very real for you, or a very applied debate for you about empiricism and whether the world is apprehensible in ideal ways as well as material ways. But maybe not a conversation we can have now. So thanks so much for your time. That was really great. I think it's going to be... I'll probably edit it down a little bit, but I think it's going to be a great, super readable, super interesting transcript.
I mean, you probably need to put in a lot of context as well.
What I'll do is, I'll do an introduction that talks a little bit more about your work in specific.
Great.
And some of the projects you've done. I'll talk about the freedom of speech itself. I'll talk about Convention of Tiny Movements. And I know less about your... Oh, and I'll also talk about the work at the New Museum, which is is Tape Echo and the All Hearing, those two both go into it?
Yeah, the All Hearing is like the major output of the Tape Echo project kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'll sort of contextualize those three projects probably in a 2-paragraph introduction, some of your concerns, and then your discussions of forensic listening and sort of straddling politics and art will all, I think, make a good amount of sense.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks so much. I want to get this up before the weekend, just so that I can plausibly say that it's related to the New Museum show, even though that ends on Sunday.
My thing's already come down also.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why they did it, staggered it in stages, so they brought my floor down.
Well, I mean, the dirty secret of the art world is that nobody actually goes to anything.
Actually, a lot of people went to that exhibition.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a great. It was. I really enjoyed that piece, by the way. The
Oh, thank
All-Hearing. I
you.
thought it was pretty interesting to hear that theological approach to noise, and more than interesting, because just interesting isn't interesting. Um, yeah,
Um,
I mean, as a form of like no, so it's knowledgeable, it's normative, but it's also and so because it's normative, it also like allows for action based on this kind of um, um, sort of interpretation. That's and it's not a legal interpretation exactly, but maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's Islamic juridical.
well, Islam is a law, by the way. It is.
Yeah,
That's the thing with Islam.
right.
But yeah, great. No, I'm glad you got to see it. It's really good. I'm glad we got to talk.
Yeah. So let me know next time you're in New York. I'd love to pick your brains again about some other questions that I have, not for a screen context.
Sure, that would be great.
Take care, Lawrence.
You too.
Have a
Take
good day.
care.
Bye.
Bye.